Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone out there who is joining us. With that being said, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker of the day. We have Vivek Joshi. He is the CEO and founder of Entytle. He has decades of experience working on both sides of the industrial equation. He's passionate about all things install base and simplifying install base workflows to give customer-facing OEM teams an opportunity to do more with less. With that being said, Vivek, I'll pass it on to you.
Colin, thank you very much. And every time you and others say the word decades with an emphasis on decades, it reminds me of the fact that I've seen a few stories in my life, as I say. And part of this session today is to kind of share some of those knowledge, some of those stories that we've experienced, not just in the decade that we've spent building Entytle, but really in the last 30 years of my career being in and around manufacturers, like some of the folks I see on the call today, right? I've primarily worked in what I would say B2B manufacturing, which is a fancy way to say equipment manufacturers who sell to other businesses. And I find that particularly interesting for a couple of reasons. One is the ability for a manufacturer to serve another company's requirements is extraordinarily difficult. The challenges of maintaining and managing an operating piece of equipment that typically runs 24/7, almost 365 days is very, very different and difficult. And therefore, if you can master how to kind of make all that work well, it's actually it's a remarkable transformation that can happen both for the customer and the OEM. And so I've done this in my career at places that different as Johnson and Johnson, General Electric, Sun Microsystems, and I eventually started a company of my own to kind of build out this notion of install base and services and so on and so forth. So that's kind of where my experience has been. And what you're going to hear in the next 15, 20 minutes is really the combination of all these experiences, including the Entytle story as well. So, what I want to make sure you understand is that as we've gone around building this company Entytle, and I go back and rewind the tape, if you may, for the last 30 years, it is very clear to me that all of us kind of know what we want to do and why we want to do it. But sometimes what we find is that people aren't very clear about it. So there's a few points I want to make sure as you go through this next 20 minutes in terms of what I think are the lessons about the how and the when, if you may, about this install-based intelligence idea. And then we'll kind of get into some questions as you may have them as we come across this, right? So, I don't know how it is. I see a couple of Europeans on the call. There's definitely a few American companies on the call here today. It is September, and what that means is now we're all deep into the planning and budgeting season, right? You've probably started some work in July, August timeframe in terms of the 3-year strategy, 4-year, 5-year strategy plans. As you get into October, November, you're really starting to distill this thing down into an operating plan for next financial year, assuming you're on the January 1 financial year, like many European and American companies are. And if you are like everybody else, and if you're like what I did when I was a general manager, when I was a CEO, we're just trying to do two things. We're trying to drive growth at the top line. We're trying to drive operating profit growth. We're trying to make sure that we kind of start getting the KPIs that we care about in the right direction, right? And when I was a CEO and general manager of a manufacturing company, what I was always trying to do is like, okay, what is my easiest and fastest way to get there? And candidly, there's a traditional waterfall, if you may, that we all think about. And I always gravitated to it. Maybe that's why we're building Entytle the way we are. I always gravitated to the fact that you have the ability to start driving value into and through your install base. Most of you have been in business, most of your companies have been in business for, I don't know, decades, right? 30, 40, 50 years at least. And most of you make products that are long-lived assets, which means that the relationships you have with your existing customers can be as long as 10, 20 years, or sometimes even longer, which means you have these existing install base and relationships. So the ability for you guys to drive growth and profit in that install base is extraordinarily powerful, and unfortunately very often gets overlooked very easily. And so part of what this session is about to say, hey, don't forget your install base, because from what we've seen, 80% of the existing customers will probably buy new equipment from you over the course of the life of the asset, which means it behooves you to pay attention to the aka install base. So this is something that I want to make sure you understand is in paying attention to the install base, not just for aftermarket and services, but for new equipment sales is important. So start right there because that's the lowest hanging fruit you can find. So great. So you did that. And then what? What I find quite often is interesting is when we talk to customers, when we talk to prospects, or when I talk to my peers in manufacturing who I've known for many years, you know, it is not always clear to me that they know what they want to do with the install base and why. And more importantly, who's going to execute it, right? So I had a call with a prospect about a week ago, I think it was, and I think it is Colin and I on the call. And I remember asking this person about this strategy about trying to get information and data to start driving install base value. So I asked this leader, he's a VP of service, it's like, so tell me who's going to use this and how? How are you going to build this story back from the end user back, the install base, to the personas in your team, which could be sales or service or marketing, all the way back to a factory for fulfillment? How is that chain going to work? Who's going to do what to whom and when, right? And that turns out to be a surprisingly overlooked aspect of this fundamental playbook here, right? So I always tell people, look, there's a ton of different things you can do. In fact, in our playbook, as we call it, the industrial install-based playbook, we have about 30 different use cases. And I always tell people, look, use a rule of three. Just start with the first three use cases that you care about and with whom. Right? As a salespeople, as a service people, as a marketing people, pick somebody and make those use cases work. So start right there first, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing I tell people is that, again, maturity matters. And what we mean by maturity in the aftermarket world is that do you have a combination of people, process, and technology that is synchronized for the stage of growth, stage of aspiration and ambition that you're trying to achieve, right? Quite often we'll find people, there'll be some great business leaders on who we talk to. It's like, I really want to get X, Y, and Z done. Then I ask them the question, okay, how many active salespeople do you have who can go after your install base? Well, I got an inside sales team. I said, well, let me ask you about this inside sales team. Is it inside sales team or is it inside order takers? And, sheepishly say, well, it's order takers, right? Because that's unfortunately how we in the industrial B2B world have grown up. So my first order of business is like, look, go find yourself some really good salespeople, inside or outside, it doesn't matter, who are going to go do these things. Then make sure you build the process and technology around this stuff. And then start doing the progression along the way, right? So our view to this situation is very simple. Like, it's first people, get the who in place, then how to kind of make it work, and then think of the technologies, right? So this is probably heretical coming from me as a technology CEO to say people, process, and then tools. But without these foundations in place, without you driving the maturity level in the right place, it just will not work. And I think that's something that's important, I think, for me to emphasize. Trust me, I want to sell software as much as the next person, but without the first two places, without the first two building blocks being in place, the third one doesn't work, right? So then you start doing that. So get your salespeople in order, get them trained correctly. On a side note, I've seen an extraordinarily big, what I would call skill will gap, because many of us have grown up in companies where we call inside sales really order taking. There's no skill level of what it takes to prospect and hunt, and even in your install base, let alone cold prospecting and hunting, right? It just takes training, but it also takes the right personality, right? We always say there has to be will as well, right? And so you have to have the will part of it as well. And then you can kind of build the stuff around it, right? So start with that, because without the key players, you're not gonna win. The second thing I would say to you is, and many of you know this, but I want to keep reminding people about this all the time, is that install-based intelligence, you need data from many, many functions, right? It was very apparent to me when I was running a manufacturing service shop or service business that I needed to get data from reliability engineering. I needed to get data from the manufacturing people about the inventory, what the latest part supersession data was, and so on and so forth. I needed to get the service ops people, the service ops people to give us bill of materials, the field service people to tell me what happened in the field. Can I keep track of it? You need data from multiple functions. And the only people who know how to put data from multiple functions together, unfortunately, are the people, the veteran workforce today that's retiring, right? So you have this big problem that's looming in every one of your companies that says, I need data from all over the place. The only people who need to know, who understand how to do this are these people who've been tenured workers, 20, 30, 40 years in the saddle. How do I get this thing going in the right direction? But if you keep that in mind, then you start saying, okay, well, in addition to the fact that I got a bunch of people who know this stuff who are retiring, the ability for me to take the data that exists in the company in all these different functions and put it together is monumentally difficult, right? We show this chart every time to people, and by the way, this is not an advertising chart, but this is just a fact of life chart, right? We show this chart to everybody, and this is probably the universal place where we get head nods from everybody, right? And so when you start looking at this chart and saying, okay, I have this insurmountable problem, what do I do about it, right? That's kind of when this thing becomes a reality. So it's really easy to say, go after the installed base, low-hanging fruit. It's really easy to say that, hey, get the right people in place. But when you start trying to enable these salespeople with the right information, with the right tools, you're going to run into this problem of crazy amounts of data and crazy mess on your hands, right? So this is something that's really important for you guys to understand, that it isn't as simple as it sounds, but it has to get conquered for you to move to the next stage of maturity. So again, I always say, look, going back from the outside in, going back from the customer back, going back from the use case back, start doing that. Go back to that playbook we talked about, whatever the playbook is, figure out the use cases, the top 2 or 3. Once you define what those use cases are, then you can go define what your data requirements are. Not for every use case do you need all this data that I showed you in the previous page. You can start really simple. You can start with something very simple, let's say, getting data from a reliability engineering team saying, look, for these 25 components, tell me what my failure rates are, and tell me what this information is in terms of, if you know it by segment of population or segment of customer base and so on and so forth. And if you do, just run yourself a simple little spreadsheet that says, I have all these customers in this segment. Here are the 25 components that ought to fail in these intervals. I'm going to literally go back and count days from the birth date, aka shipping date, and count it forward. Let's see what happens, right? So you can start as simple as that and kind of start building it, because you cannot go start making life too complex. When I was in consulting, and many moons ago I was in consulting, the favorite framework is what we call a 2x2 matrix. Vertical axis, some attribute, horizontal axis, one attribute. And in this case, what I always say to people is like, if you have one attribute that says what I call volume of data, and the other axis is complexity data, I'll start with simple data and a low volume as a way to start it, right? You do not want to make your life any more challenging and difficult than it needs to be right now in terms of making this thing work. So start there, start with this use cases, and make it much easier for yourself to do it. And so what then that happens is allows you to experiment on a very small scale, right? So start small and then go big. So get the candidates, like I said, in addition to all these things, that change management is important. I always tell people, if you're going to choose a territory or vertical market or whatever it could be, where you want to start this experiment, start with somebody who's willing to learn and change, because there will be roadblocks, there will be failures, there will be hurdles that you'll have to go through, and you need somebody who's willing to learn and change along with you. Because if you don't, the naysayers come out in full force, right? The second trick is you need to have a reasonably sufficient size, if you may, of this experiment, where people don't say, you just tried it in 2 customers. You can't translate that to 5,000. They're right. So build the right sample size, if you may, that's just big enough for you to put your hands around, but large enough for people who won't question your credibility and make sure they understand how this can scale. And then you go through the whole routine of how you kind of get these things to win, how do you test the ideas, how you measure it, and how you start building the playbook out of it, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a lot of different things you can do along the way that just makes it easy for you to start rolling this thing out in systematic order. But I always tell people, listen, don't go conquer the world. We have some customers who unfortunately decided to go, quote unquote, worldwide from day one, despite our recommendations not to do it. 3 years later, they just finished the implementation because of exactly many of these challenges that they face out there, right? It's not something we like, it's not something they liked, but here we are 3 years later that the implementation is finally finished versus a 6 to 8 week short implementation you can get done. So when you start going through this process and learning and scaling up, then you say, okay, now the decision process starts. This is September timeframe. You're now deciding what to do, how to fund this thing. And what I see time and time again, and this is my favorite saying also, it's easier said than done, right? The do-it-yourself solution is a common trap that people get into. Well, it's only data, it's only software. I have engineers, I can go figure it out how to build it, right? Yes, you can, and you can go do it. We've got a little calculator on the website that says how much it takes to go build one of these things. So you should go scope that out. But what this calculator doesn't show is not just the timeline it shows below and the bottom line, how long it takes to kind of get this thing going, but the fact that you will have a non-supportable technology and asset you just built because the IT people you hired or the contractor you hired is long gone by the time this starts, right? So you wind up with a situation of the DIY solution, and what we find is homegrown solutions simply don't scale. Yes, when you go from a spread, by the way, I did say when I start small, start with a spreadsheet, start with something very simple. But when you start making it go across your install base, and again, I see one of the participants on the call today has, I don't know, 3,000 people just in Europe, 10,000 customers worldwide. It's a massive install base of customer locations and multiple assets per location. You simply can't do it using many of the tools you have today. In fact, we've looked at this across the board with the common vendors that you see in the world today, and most of them don't have it. Now, having said that, one of these guys out here, I will not name names, who just announced something recently that claims to address this problem, but it's a recent announcement, not a long-term running situation. So you can go back to your IT team, have them go to the looks. They will tell you that the common vendors don't have the solution. Then you have to decide what to do with this thing, right? So when you start getting into the process, my view is like, look, you have to take advantage of the others. There's people who've solved this problem before you. Go minimize the risk instead of creating the risk on your own balance sheet. Let somebody else take the risk. And people like Entytle, people like some of the other folks in the world today have already taken the risk and built a solution that matters. It gives you a whole variety of different benefits, and you can start taking advantage of the situation. So you start looking at the different vendors out there and start making a business case from it. And then when you go back to this, there's a calculator on our website. In addition to the little one we have a more detailed calculator on make versus buy. And you can start going with this, what we call rinse, repeat, and scale, which is, you've built the first prototype, you expand it to a larger territory, larger area, larger product line, whatever it could be, and then start expanding from there. And my last admonition is that, when in doubt, always choose the change motivated team, because I've seen far more failures with people who are trying to protect the status quo and not change than it's worth the headache that you're going to go through when you start this process. So I think with that, my simple statement, which is, I love this statement, is, look, there's never the right time to kind of do this thing. The really, really right time might have been 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Most of us never took advantage of this stuff. The next best time is today, right? So just go ahead and get started, because if not, you'll always be thinking about this next year, next financial year, 2 financial years from now, and this never gets done right. So with that, same page as a summary, focus on what you want to get done, make sure your ambitions are sized correctly to who you are and what your maturity of the organization is, and then just start rolling it out, because if you don't, you'll still be thinking about this next year as well. That's it. That's our story. And so with that, Colin, I'm going to turn it over to you to see if there's any questions that have come in, or these questions that are something to answer out here. So Colin, over to you.
Sure. Thanks for that, Vivek. We didn't have a few questions come in. As I asked them, maybe we'll get some more as people think of some other things to ask. One of the first ones is, why would partnering with a third-party off-the-shelf solution be more beneficial than us building something specifically that will fit our needs outside of time and money?
I think there's 2 or 3 different things I would say to you, right? One is clearly, a third-party vendor has done this multiple times versus you guys doing it for the first and probably the only time. So there's a question of, as we see in the US, we've got a lot more at-bats than a traditional internal IT team would have. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is something that I learned a long time ago, is third-party people and vendors like us, or system integrators that you may work with, also have what I call a best practices playbooks, right? They've seen this thing multiple times. They know how it works. They know what to do. In fact, some of the suggestions, some of the ideas I shared with you today are based on my learnings over the last 30 years, not just the last 10 years, right? So you get a lot of best practices that are embedded in the solution and embedded in the deployment teams that you guys coming across with. The third thing is, because you wind up with a third-party vendor that's built for purpose, you have huge advantage of speed and cost, right? We've seen this time and time again, where people think they can do it 3 years later, they're still getting off the ground. It hasn't been completed. And so everybody's unhappy, right? So there's multiple reasons, but those are the three top reasons, Colin, in my mind, why like a third-party vendor would be a better to go with than trying to do it yourself.
Got it. Next one, it resonates with one of your slides, the homegrown solution slide. We're already consolidating data into Power BI. How are other solutions or something like Entytle going to be different?
So I like the fact that you're already consolidating stuff into Power BI, which tells me two things. One is you understand the pain it is to go consolidate and unify data, so you understand the challenge you've went through. Secondly, you're demonstrating to me a propensity that you care about analytics and understanding it, because Power BI has a reasonable amount of analytics and visualizations. But the single biggest challenge we've seen with Power BI or similar solutions is that they simply don't allow you to execute workflows beyond being a dashboarding or visualization or really dashboarding visualization tools. So in other words, if you look at some information and you see a wallet share chart, it's not like you can click on that wallet share chart and trigger a sales process with it, or trigger a prospecting process with it, right? Or manage the workflow coming out of that wallet share gap analysis, if you may, right? So that's the fundamental shortcoming today in Power BI. The second problem with Power BI is somebody's always got to keep the engine running behind the scenes, right? So somebody in the IT team, somebody in the business analysis team always has to keep doing the work. And I think that's part of the challenge people face. The third part we've seen in this Power BI or business intelligence world is that almost every single company we work with is always making changes to the what are called source systems, BDRP or CRMs or field service, warranty, PLMs, whatever. And the moment you make changes to those source systems, your destination system, aka your data warehouse where Power BI can reside, all those data flows change, which means somebody's debugging this stuff again and again and again. Why do I say that? Because we've lived it ourselves, right? Our customers make a change. We wind up seeing the changes on our side. We have to go back and fix it. But because we do this every day for a living, we can do it much faster. So there's multiple reasons why you wouldn't necessarily go with a business intelligence solution like a Power BI. It's great to start with it, by the way. I always recommend you start with it, but it's not a production grade tool for the purposes of workflow management.
One last question that I have, is to give people a chance to keep on asking, is what should my plan of action be to start investing into an install-based solution if we're not ready to execute on the use cases?
Can you repeat the last part, Colin? I can repeat the question again one more time if you don't mind.
What should my plan of action be to start investing into an install-based solution if we're not ready to execute on the predetermined use cases?
Plan of action. I think it goes back to one of my earlier slides, which basically says, look, if you forget the solution for a second, right? If you consider the fact that install base is valuable and you have a couple of different ideas on how best to start deriving the value, be it cross-sell, upsell, wallet share capture, whatever it might be, just pick one or two use cases and use a spreadsheet. As much as I don't like spreadsheets, just use something simple. You don't need to go build these fancy tools. You don't need anything. You need a good, smart analyst and data person to kind of help you sort through this stuff. So I would just start very, very simple. Again, like I said, much against my own thing, I'd rather just start with a simple spreadsheet.
All right, we got an active audience here. We got another question that came in during that one is, where do you see the Entytle platform in 3 to 5 years from now in terms of feature capability roadmap?
So I think there's two things I would say to you. One is an overarching theme, which is called autonomous aftermarket, which is a fancy way to say we just want to make everything automated, intelligent, and independent, right? So that's the overarching theme of how we think about it. The second theme I would say to you is just like when you and I go to a doctor's office or hospital and there's this thing called EMR, electronic medical record system. I view Entytle as effectively like an EMR for assets, which means that there's a combination of technologies we're building into Entytle now that we've already started, which is using the large language models to look through service notes and product brochures and repair manuals and so on and so forth to bring systematically much more in-depth intelligence to a workflow and process. That's point number one. Point number two, we are now beginning to build out specific workflows. For example, a inspection application, a campaign email writer. We're looking at how to take IoT data and make that part of the dashboard for the service and sales executive, right? So those are the kinds of things we're beginning to start building into the workflows. And the third part we're doing, which we're just releasing, I hope in the next week or two, deep integrations into Salesforce first, and then Microsoft Dynamics next. We're not doing IFS yet, though people have asked us about it, but those two are deep integrations. So if you're a sales and service executive, you probably want your people to be in the existing CRMs. And so we're going to let you kind of make that happen easily. So that's kind of how we're thinking about the next 3 to 5 years for Entytle.
Great. Thanks for that. That was the last question that we had. If anybody else wants to ask us more questions, we have Vivek's email up here as well. The QR code will also take you to our website where you can also find additional information and context on us. I wanted to again thank everybody for joining today, and we'll see you on the next one.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to share this information with you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.